In the early morning of June 18, 2019, a police patrol was working a routine circuit through Araucagua, a quiet district on the road between the Bolivian city of Cochabamba and the neighboring municipality of Sacaba. Parked at the roadside, apparently abandoned, stood a white BMW estate. It was an expensive car for that stretch of road, and no one was visible in the passenger compartment. As an officer approached, he noticed something on one of the rear doors. It was blood. When investigators opened the boot, they found the body of a man. He had been beaten and stabbed, and someone had taken care to fold him into the luggage compartment of his own car. The man in the boot of the BMW was Percy Marcelo Zagara Villarroel. He was 58 years old, and for more than 22 years he had earned his living in the air. He was known to almost everyone by his middle name, Marcelo. He had been educated at the Don Bosco school in Cochabamba, and according to his son Diego, he knew from childhood exactly what he intended to become. His family were lawyers, and his parents wanted him to follow the family profession. He refused. His destiny, as Diego put it, was in the air, and he imposed his dream over their objections. Zagara began his career with Lloyd Aéreo Boliviano, the historic national airline that had connected Bolivia's cities across the Andes for the better part of a century before its collapse. Records from 2009 show he once served as executive secretary of the Workers' Federation of that defunct carrier, a position of trust among his fellow aviation workers. When the state founded a new flag carrier, Boliviana de Aviación, known throughout the country simply as BOA, Zagara moved to its cockpits. By 2019 he was a captain, one of the senior pilots of the national airline, flying in and out of Cochabamba, the valley city in central Bolivia where he had made his home, and which runs seamlessly eastward into Sacaba, the municipality where his car would be found. Percy Zagara was a father of 3, 2 sons and a daughter. He had divorced some 15 years earlier, and his former wife and daughter were living in the United States. In Cochabamba, he lived alone in a flat in the Mediterraneo condominium until roughly 2 months before his death, when his son Marcelo returned to Bolivia and moved in with him. His other son, Diego, would later put his father's relationship with work simply. He loved what he did so much that despite having everything he needed to retire, he decided to keep working, and retirement was in view. Alongside his airline salary, Zagara had built up legitimate side businesses. Reporting at the time described a used car dealership and a trading business dealing in goods that included backpacks. He was, by every account his family has given, a man preparing to land softly, with businesses to run and children to visit on 2 continents. On June 17, 2019, Zagara flew nowhere. It was an ordinary day on the ground in Cochabamba, and what is known of his evening was pieced together afterwards from shop records, cameras, and the memories of the people around him. At about 7:15 that evening, he arrived at a jewellery and watch shop in the city. Its owner was a friend of many years' standing. The 2 men drank coffee together. The shop ordinarily closed between 8 and 8:30 at night, but that evening the owner asked his employee to shut early. At 3 minutes to 8, the shutters came down, and the owner climbed into the passenger seat of Zagara's white BMW. The car pulled away into the evening traffic, heading east. The owner would later say that Percy drove him to Plazuela Tarija, where the owner himself was supposed to meet a woman. She never arrived, he claimed, so after waiting about half an hour he went home. According to that account, this was the last he saw of Percy. At some point that evening, Percy Zagara's telephone fell silent, and he did not come home. At the Mediterraneo condominium, his son Marcelo waited. His father did not appear, and his father's phone was switched off. That in itself was unusual for a man whose profession ran on punctuality. As the evening wore on, Marcelo began ringing the people most likely to know where his father was. 2 calls went to 2 of his father's closest friends, the jeweller he had gone to see that evening, and another friend of the family, a man who managed a motel in Cochabamba. Both men took his calls. Both men were reassuring. And both men, Marcelo would later recount, told him essentially the same thing. Your father is a reserved man. He's probably out with a woman. Each then passed him telephone numbers, contacts of people his father might be with. Marcelo rang them. Nobody had seen the captain. By morning, the search was over. It ended at the roadside in Aracagua, with a patrol officer looking at blood on the door of a white BMW. The autopsy counted the cost. Percy Zagara's face was disfigured, his skull fractured by blows from blunt objects, and his neck and body bore 18 stab wounds. The formal cause of death was recorded as injury to the higher nerve centers and a multifragmentary fracture of the frontal bone of the skull, the medical language for a head broken by tremendous force. One forensic observation shaped everything that followed. For wounds of that severity, there was not enough blood at the scene. Investigators concluded that Aracagua was not where the captain had died. He had been killed somewhere else, placed in the boot of his own car, and driven to that roadside. The early record also offered estimates of time, and they would not go unchallenged. The first medical reporting put the death at approximately midnight, and police initially presumed the vehicle had been left at the roadside at around 4 a.m, 2 hours before the patrol found it. Almost every hour in this case would eventually be contested by someone. The investigation fell to the Fiscalia, Bolivia's public prosecutor's office, working with a specialist police unit called the FELCC, the Special Force for the Fight Against Crime. In those first days, they kept their options open. The departmental police commander told the press the killing might be a settling of accounts, a personal or sentimental dispute, or a kidnapping that had gone wrong. Each line was pulled. Zagara was known to have had a former girlfriend who worked at the same airline, and investigators duly examined his personal life. It led nowhere. Colleagues from BOA, a pilot and a flight attendant, gave statements in the first days, part of the routine mapping of the dead man's world. Officers noted that a crime of pure robbery seemed not to fit the scene, and yet the captain's wallet was missing, along with his watch and other items of value. The family, for their part, pushed back firmly against any insinuation that the captain had been involved in anything improper. They described a man with a spotless career and legitimate businesses. There was one apparently promising lead. Relatives said that on the afternoon before his death, Percy had argued heatedly with somebody about a debt. The confrontation was serious enough for other people to step between them, and the person was detained for questioning after the body was found. Investigators also followed the most obvious trail, the last place Percy was known to have been alive. That led them back to the jewellery shop. At first, its owner spoke as a witness. He acknowledged that Percy had visited, but said they had parted at the shop door and that he had walked west before taking a taxi home. Then investigators established that the owner had actually climbed into Percy's BMW. Being the last person publicly documented leaving with the captain did not prove he had killed him, particularly while the police were still examining other motives and did not know where the murder had occurred. But it meant the jeweller's first account was already in trouble. The funeral of Percy Zagara was attended by the people you would expect: colleagues, relatives, and friends. Among the mourners were the jeweller and the motel administrator, the two men Marcelo had telephoned on the night of the search. They expressed their condolences. They accompanied the family through the vigil and the burial. The family did not comprehend what was happening to them. They wept, and they buried their father amid doubts they could not yet name. Then, after the burial, the jeweller sought Marcelo out to talk, and the family's questions about money were only beginning. The jeweller's name was Elmer Zubieta Aguila. He was 40 years old, the owner of a well-known jewellery and watch business, and his friendship with the captain was of such long standing that Zagara's children called him uncle. In that first conversation, Elmer acknowledged a debt to the dead man of $7,000. In a second meeting, he retreated. He owed nothing. In a final encounter, the story inverted entirely. It was the captain, he now said, who had owed money to him. 3 meetings, 3 versions. And Marcelo was in a position to notice, because he knew something most mourners did not. His father regularly lent money within his personal and business circle, sometimes using signed documents and sometimes recording the arrangement in a diary. The family went through their father's papers. According to their account, they found documentation of substantial lending, a digital register of debts, and a handwritten agenda in which the captain recorded his collections. The agenda, they said, was found with alterations and erasures. Among the names they associated with the largest sums were the two men from the night of the telephone calls, Elmer Zubieta and the friend who managed the motel in Cochabamba. Taking the amounts together, the family put the total at more than $200,000. The lawyer who came to represent them would later speak of over $500,000. The precise figure has never been fixed in a single public document. But the family's conviction, formed in those weeks, never wavered. Their father had been demanding his money back, and they themselves had overheard calls about those demands. The family took what they had found to the investigators, and the two inquiries, the official one and the private one, converged. On July 31st, 2019, a month and a half after the murder, police investigators and prosecutors raided a motel on the Avenida Chapare in Cochabamba. There, they detained its administrator, Oscar Andy Cairo Áñez, 38 years old, the second man Marcelo had telephoned on the night his father disappeared. A judge ordered him held on remand in the San Sebastián prison as a suspect in the killing. 2 days later, Elmer Zubieta presented himself at the prosecutor's office to give a statement. He did not leave as a free man. He was arrested on the spot, his shop was sealed by investigators, and a judge sent him to preventive detention in El Abra prison in Cochabamba. Both men denied any involvement in the murder. But when investigators compared their accounts, the versions contradicted each other, and the investigators had something else to compare them against. Within days of his arrest, Andy asked to expand his statement. Prosecutors said he supplied information suggesting that more people had participated. The public version of his account would develop over the next 2 years, and it would eventually include names and a description of the attack. At this stage, however, the important change was that the inquiry no longer concerned only the jeweler and the motel manager. Investigators were looking for other people who might have been waiting at the place where Percy was killed. Investigators then turned to the mobile phone data. When a mobile phone is active, it connects through antennas serving particular coverage areas. Those records cannot identify an exact room or street address in the way a GPS trace can, but a sequence of connections can indicate a handset's general route. When investigators mapped the phones of the men around Percy Zagara on June 17th, a picture emerged, one area at a time. It began before dawn. From early that morning, the records showed Elmer Zubieta called the captain repeatedly, and there was a pattern to those calls. Each time he hung up with Zagara, he telephoned Andy Cairo. Through the afternoon, between 21 minutes past 4 and 21 minutes to 7, Elmer's phone was making calls through the antenna serving Pacata Baja, a residential zone on the eastern side of the city, on the way to Cochabamba. It was the zone where Andy Cairo had his house. During that window, the records showed Elmer was in contact with a fourth telephone, that of his own brother, Jorge. Then, between roughly 8 and 9 that evening, something notable happened. The brothers' phones went silent. Both handsets, the family's lawyer stated, were switched off. At 9 minutes past 9, Elmer Zubieta's phone came back to life. The antenna that registered it was in Aracagua, the zone where the BMW carrying Percy Zagara's body was abandoned. Set against those records, even Elmer's revised explanation did not hold. He said he had gone home after waiting at Plazuela Tarija, but the antenna records registered his phone in coverage areas near Pacata, and at 9 minutes past 9, Aracagua, at the very time he claimed to be arriving at his front door. Later, at trial, the story changed again. Now he said the woman had arrived, and that they had driven together towards the motel district on the Cochabamba road, the same corridor where the body was dumped, before she rejected his proposal, and he turned back. The family's lawyer, Julio Miguel Torrico, drew one further inference from the data, which he would repeat at trial. Earlier on the day of the murder, the records traced a route being driven in daylight, around the Circunvalación Ring Road, as far as the Wara Wara Bridge. down a street past the cemetery, into the zone registered by the Quintanilla antenna, where the body would later be left, and out along the Cochabamba highway, where the antenna at the road service caught the handset again as it travelled away. That night, the same route was driven again, ending with the car abandoned by the reconstruction between 5 and 10 minutes past 9, and throughout the night journey, the phone was in communication with another person. A reconnaissance run, Torrico argued. The disposal had been rehearsed in the afternoon and repeated in the dark. He called it a work of watchmaker's precision, and he chose the metaphor deliberately. That reconstruction placed the abandonment of the BMW shortly after 9 in the evening. It was several hours earlier than the first police estimate, which had put it at approximately 4 the following morning. The later timing rested on the prosecution's interpretation of the telephone records rather than a witness who had watched the car arrive. It strengthened the case against Elmer, but it did not turn the antenna data into an exact vehicle tracker. The debts produced a contradiction of their own. Elmer denied from the beginning of the process that he owed the captain anything. Yet one of the loan documents bearing his signature had been the subject of a separate civil proceeding, in which, according to Torrico, Elmer denied that the signature was his. Confronted with the same document at the murder trial, he accepted the signature and said the amount had been paid. Before the civil judge, he denied his signature, the lawyer observed, and here he accepts it. And then there was the wallet. During a search of Elmer Zubieta's jewelry shop, investigators found Percy Zagara's wallet in the shop's private bathroom. Inside were his identity card, his bank cards, and photographs of his children. The wallet itself would never reach a courtroom. In November 2019, 5 months after the murder, Bolivia convulsed in a political crisis. President Evo Morales resigned amid disputed elections, and in the unrest that followed, crowds attacked public buildings. Among them was the Cochabamba headquarters of the FELCC, which was set on fire. The wallet, held there in evidence, was reportedly destroyed in the blaze. What survived was the formal seizure record, the legal document attesting to where it had been found. The prosecution would have to rely on the paper, not the object. At trial, that meant the judges could not inspect the wallet themselves. The prosecution instead relied on the seizure documentation and testimony about where it had been recovered. The fire had not erased the recorded chain of custody, but it had deprived both sides of the ability to examine the physical object again. By early 2020, with both men approaching 6 months in preventive detention, the case against them looked substantial. Torrico told the press that the investigation had reached its final stage and that 3 further people connected to the accused would be summoned to give statements. The prosecution's working theory of roles was blunt at that point. One man to kill the pilot and make the evidence disappear, the other to hide the vehicle and the body. The finished version presented at trial would be more elaborate, but the skeleton was already visible. The case was not, however, uncontested. Elmer Zubieta's lawyer argued that Andy Cairo alone knew the truth. According to the defense, Cairo visited Elmer the day after the murder, claimed he had killed the captain by accident, and threatened Elmer and his wife into silence. No court established that account, and it sat awkwardly beside Elmer's own shifting statements, but it framed a defense position that never changed. Cairo was responsible and had redirected the investigation towards Elmer. The defense also accused investigators of missing evidence. The lawyers maintained that the genetic results did not establish a full match to either Zubieta brother, and Elmer's condominium entry log was said to support his claim that he was home when the captain died. Those were genuine issues for the judges to weigh, particularly because Cairo's later account would redirect responsibility away from himself and towards the Zubieta brothers. Both men asked the courts in February 2020 to await trial at liberty. One hearing collapsed when a defense lawyer could not reach the courtroom because of a road blockade, a routine hazard of Bolivian civic life. Neither man was freed. After 9 months of investigation, prosecutors filed the formal murder accusation in March 2020. A trial expected within a few months was delayed for more than a year. One scheduled opening in March 2021 was postponed after a judge became ill with COVID-19. Proceedings finally began the following month, extending the period, in which both defendants remained imprisoned without a verdict. The trial of Elmer Zubieta and Andy Cairo opened in April 2021 before the Sentencing Tribunal No. 1 of Cochabamba. In Bolivia, serious crimes are tried not by juries, but by panels of judges sitting as sentencing tribunals, and this panel would hear evidence for 6 months. When it began, prosecutors acknowledged they were still waiting on the results of certain forensic examinations, and both defendants maintained their innocence, as they had from the day of their arrests. Then, early in the trial, the case turned on a hard drive. Andy Cairo's motel had cameras, and the recordings from the days around the murder were gone. According to the evidence, Cairo had asked for help to wipe the DVR, the recorder that stored the footage, explaining to those he asked that he had quarreled with a business partner and wanted to avoid problems. But deleted is not always destroyed. During the trial, a technical expert recovered the recordings. What the cameras had seen was this. On June 16, 2019, the day before the murder, Andy Cairo entered his own motel accompanied by a foreign guest, a Brazilian man, who took a room. On the evening of the 17th, at 22 minutes past 7, a few minutes after Percy Zagara walked into the jewelry shop across town, Cairo left the motel in a vehicle with the Brazilian, bound for his house in Cochabamba. And at 29 minutes past 6 on the morning of the 18th, hours after the white BMW had been abandoned in Araucagua, Cairo returned to the motel. According to the investigation, the foreigner was put on a flight north to Cobija, the Bolivian city on the Brazilian border, and crossed out of the country. On May 14, 2021, Andy Cairo asked the tribunal for permission to speak. His account, as repeated in trial reporting, was this. On the evening of June 17, 2019, all of them were at his house in Pacata. Himself, Elmer Zubieta, Elmer's brother Jorge, the Brazilian, and the captain. The discussion was about money, the sums Percy Zagara was demanding back. The conversation became an argument, and when Zagara moved to leave, he was intercepted. One of the brothers seized him by the neck from behind. The Brazilian struck him on the skull with a stone. Two of the men, wearing gloves, beat him as he tried to defend himself, and Cairo said the captain, in the midst of it, appealed to him directly. "Andy, we are friends." Cairo told the court he froze, that he was in shock, and that by the time he could react, Elmer was demanding the keys to the BMW. The attackers took Zagara's wallet, his watch, and his jewelry. Then, realizing the captain was still alive, they stabbed him 18 times, in the neck and body, and finished him with the stone. Cairo said the men began to lift the body towards the front seats of the BMW until Elmer ordered it placed in the boot. 3 of them drove away with the captain's body. Cairo stayed behind, he admitted, to clean the house. He cleaned it thoroughly. The prosecution and the family alleged the sitting room wall was later repainted to cover the blood. The family's lawyer said a painter was hired for the purpose. Cairo admitted wiping the DVR. He told the court he had been psychologically paralyzed by what he witnessed and that he acted afterwards under threat. He pointed across the courtroom and named Elmer Zubieta as the man who, in his words, planned the crime, and highlighted the fact that Elmer's brother, Juan Zubieta himself, had an $8,800 debt to one of Percy's sons. This was the account of a confessed participant, given early in his own trial, and it has never been accepted by the men it accused. But it supplied what the prosecution's file had lacked, a narrative of what happened inside the house. Elmer denied everything to the last day of the trial. He suggested, in turn, that it was Cairo who knew the truth, and claimed Cairo had threatened him not to reveal the location of the house. The two defenses devoured each other in front of the judges. On October 6, 2021, after closing arguments in which the sons of Percy Zagara were permitted to address the court, the tribunal retired. Marcelo asked the two accused, one final time, to tell the truth. "They killed my father for money," he told the court. "We would give up the money to have one more day with him." The judges deliberated for at least 11 hours. The families of the victim and of the accused paced the corridors of the Cochabamba courthouse into the night. At around 10 o'clock in the evening, the tribunal returned. Elmer Zubieta Aguilar and Oscar Andy Cairo Añez were declared guilty of the murder of Percy Marcelo Zagara Villarroel. The sentence for each was the maximum available in Bolivian law, 30 years imprisonment without right of pardon, to be served in El Abra prison. The case had been argued for the state by prosecutors Giovanni Campos and Joel Ramos. 30 years was not a reduced substitute for a life sentence chosen by these judges. Article 118 of Bolivia's constitution sets 30 years of imprisonment without a right to pardon as the country's maximum criminal sanction. By imposing it on both defendants, the court had reached the legal ceiling available to it. There was still the matter of the third Bolivian. Juan Jorge Zubieta, Elma's brother, had been arrested in May 2021 in the middle of the first trial, shortly after Cairo named him from the witness stand. Officers found him at a branch of Joyeria Tokyo, the jewelry business associated with his brother. Jorge declined to give a statement and was sent to preventive detention in the San Antonio prison, while a separate case proceeded. He continued to exercise his right to silence, declining even to take part in face-to-face confrontations with his accuser. The principal evidence against him was Cairo's testimony, supported in the prosecution's reading by the telephone records, the afternoon calls between the brothers through the Pacata Baja antenna, and the silence of both handsets during the hour of the killing. On February 22, 2023, the Sentencing Tribunal No. 4 of Cochabamba found Jorge Zubieta guilty of the murder. The court accepted that his role had been to seize the captain from behind, enabling the attack, and afterwards to help his brother load the body into the BMW. He, too, received 30 years in El Abra. With 3 maximum sentences now imposed, he said the chapter had closed. That sense of completion would last for a little over 2.5 years. 3 men convicted, the maximum sentence 3 times over. Only the mysterious Brazilian who had fled remained unaccounted for, a man with no name in the file, last recorded boarding a flight to the border. The Zagara family allowed themselves to believe the case was closed. Then, years after the courts had imposed their maximum sentences, something genuinely unexpected happened. Bolivia's higher courts began pulling the verdicts apart. In October 2025, Jorge Zubieta's conviction was annulled and a new trial was ordered. The appeal judges did not declare him innocent. They found that the original court had not adequately explained why it believed Andy Cairo's account, had described a partial genetic match too strongly, and had even treated Jorge's refusal to speak or confront his accuser as evidence of guilt. In other words, a man sentenced to 30 years had been penalized, in part, for exercising his right to remain silent. Elma Zubieta's case was reopened for a different reason. Bolivia's highest court found that the judges who confirmed his conviction had failed to answer important defense arguments, including the condominium logbook said to place him at home. Elma was not acquitted, and his original conviction still formally stands. But the decision confirming it was erased, and a new appellate ruling is now required. 7 years after a police patrol found Percy in the boot of his car, the case no longer has the clean ending it once appeared to have. Andy Cairo's conviction remains intact, although he has been under house arrest since reporting death threats from other prisoners in 2023. Jorge faces a new trial. Elma awaits a new decision on his appeal, and the unidentified Brazilian remains missing. After the first verdict, Percy's son Diego wrote in a public letter that it was easier to prove the truth than to invent lies. In the courts of Cochabamba, that truth is still waiting for its final word.